What's up? In this video, we are going over how to shutter drag on the dance floor and add some life into your photos. So when we talk about doing a shutter drag on the dance floor, how does it work? It's essentially blending a slow shutter speed with a fast flash duration. A slow shutter speed is going to blur motion. So if we use a slow shutter and move our camera around, everything gets blurred. But a flash has such a fast duration, it's going to freeze motion. When we blend these two together, we get this really cool effect of the flash freezing parts of our image and the slow shutter speed blurring out the rest of it. When it comes to doing a shutter drag, the exposure levels really matter. Because we're blending that frozen flash with a slow shutter, we need to make sure that the ambient exposure never overpowers the flash. What I mean by that is if your flash exposure is up here, we do that slow shutter speed and allow the ambient exposure to come up here, everything in here is going to get blurred and the flash exposure is going to stay frozen. But if we let that ambient exposure overtake the flash, then we no longer get that frozen effect from the flash. You can see a case of it in this image right here where the flash is gridded and it's hitting the bride's face, but you can see on her chest, the bright purple DJ light is overpowering the flash, which is why we're seeing that blur in this area. All right, moving on into what settings should we use to do a proper shutter drag. The first question is whether or not you should use rear curtain sync on your flash or regular sync. Rear curtain sync would mean that your shutter is going to open and then the flash is going to fire right before the shutter closes. Versus a regular sync, it's going to fire as soon as the shutter opens. The advantage of using rear curtain sync is that you're going to get all of the blur and then you're going to freeze your subject at the end and essentially overlap your subject onto the blur. I personally never use rear curtain sync. I don't shutter drag for a long enough period of time when the dance floor is open to really care much. And I also don't mind the look of the occasional light blur crossing over my subject. One of the things I also do is I try to keep all the bright lights that I'm trying to blur, I try to keep them from interfering with my subject's face. If you're using rear curtain sync, you can have it interfere a little bit more because you're flashing afterwards, but I just try to avoid the interference if I can. Now, when it comes to the shutter speed, I usually end up somewhere between 1/5 of a second and 1/15 of a second. I've done shutter drags as low as half a second, but once you get into too long of a shutter drag, it really starts to look funky, especially without rear curtain sync. So I usually stay in 1/5 to 1/15. Because of my workflow throughout the dance floor, which I love open dancing, it's one of my favorite times of the wedding to shoot, I don't just start right off the bat with shutter drags. So I will set the ambient relatively dark, isolate people with light, and shoot some photos for a little while. And then when I feel like starting to shutter drag, I slow down my shutter from 1/200th down to either 1/5 or 1/15th. And then I just readjust my other settings accordingly. The exact settings are never going to be the same. It's always going to depend on the situation. If you're very beginner to shutter drags, then I would recommend putting your shutter at 1/15th, keeping your flash off, and then setting the rest of your ambient so that way all the brightest light sources are exposed for all the brightest light sources with that slow shutter. Then turn on your flash, dial that in, and then you can start moving your camera around. But once you have more experience, then you're shooting and then you drop the shutter speed, maybe lower your ISO, increase the flash power, and you kind of just do it all on the fly. So here's an example early on in open dancing. I'm at ISO 400, f4.5, and 1/200th of a second. I'm exposed right now for those light bulbs that are in the background. Here's a straight out of camera shot. I thought that because of these light bulbs, they would make some cool streaks if I did some shutter drags. I started messing around. I changed down to 1/5 of a second still at f4.5, and I ended up dropping my ISO down to 250. I'm gonna say that I probably increased my flash power a little bit here to compensate for that lower ISO, and I like what I was getting here. Here is that straight out of camera. So then I kind of dialed everything in, and I ended up at ISO 200, f4.5, and 1/13th. And this is what I stayed with until I was done shutter dragging for the night. Once again, here's that straight out of camera. Here's that edited. So as you can see, it's kind of just micro tweaking until you get the level of exposure that you like. When you're shutter dragging, you're gonna get the most blur out of the brightest parts of the ambient. Things that are darker aren't going to blur as much because there's not as much light coming into the camera, but that also means that the brighter light sources are going to more easily interfere with your flash, which if we look at this photo again, you can see there's some light streak covering her chin right here, and then of course that purple DJ light on her chest. And again, rear curtain sync may have solved this, but if the ambient light source is brighter than your flash, it doesn't matter whether it's rear curtain sync or not, it's not going to cover it. So what's the best way to light for a shutter drag? I know a lot of people are gonna say immediately that direct flash is the way to go, which it works well. Direct flash is super easy. Everything right in front of your camera gets lit evenly with flash, and so it makes the shutter drag really easy. I personally like more shape and dimension, so I'm almost never using direct flash on the dance floor. The images that you see here, these are all lit by an AD200 that my assistant is holding on a boom pole. We kind of double team on the dance floor. I've done plenty of shots where I'm holding the boom pole. I've also shutter dragged with lights on stands. How you light it is not necessarily as important as what the light is hitting. You generally want the face being lit well. The reason I say that is because whatever isn't being lit is prone to blur. So if the light is hitting the side of the face, then the front of the face is gonna blur with that slow shutter. So you always wanna make sure, however you're lighting it, it's either coming from the direction of the camera or it's coming the direction of the subject's face. All right, moving on into what kind of camera movements are going to be best for doing a shutter drag. I'm personally a fan of this one. The reason being, as you can see in these images, if you have string lights, if there are string lights right here, and you are shaking your camera, those lights are gonna move like this, and it's a really easy way to frame your subject by doing this and trying to make the lights circulate around your subject's face. When you start doing side to side and up and down pans, that's when it's really easy to get those light streaks interfering with your subject's face. It can be done. It still works. You just got to be more cautious of how you're doing it. What I would say is stick to one movement for a period of time. Don't just randomly move it around. Like, try 10 shots twisting the camera. Try 10 shots moving it back and forth. What this brings me into is composition. I see so many people try to do the shutter drag and wonder why it's not working for them, when in my opinion, the shutter drag is working, the photo just still sucks because there's no composition. Shutter dragging, it can make it hard for composition, and this is one of the big reasons why I don't use rear curtain sync. I want the moment and I want the composition, so I'm gonna start the photo and freeze the flash when the moment happens in the composition I want, and then I'm going to move the camera. Sometimes it can look cool when it's pretty random, but the best shutter drags are gonna be when you take those light streaks into consideration with the overall composition. And my final tip for doing the shutter drags is shoot a lot. This is the one time where I'm like, hey, you should probably do some burst shooting, because there's a lot happening at once. Lights are moving, people are moving, you're moving. There's so much going on. Shoot way more than you think. Out of 100 shots, you're lucky if you get 2 really good ones. All right, so just to recap, set your ambient with that slow shutter, 1/5 to 1/15 of a shutter speed. Really try to expose for the brightest lights. Try to keep those bright lights from interfering with your subject when you're moving, Light it with on or off camera flash. As long as you are lighting your subject well, it will work. Make sure that when you are doing your camera movements and your compositions, that you have some intention. All right, that is shutter dragging on the dance floor. If you have any questions, ask them below. And I have a flash boot camp, which is totally free. It's 3 days long. Go sign up for it. Link in description. See you in the next video.